Are you seriously going to eat, you fat blibbity blabbity blob? I mean, some of you might be like,
Continual.
why would I want to start this?
Sensitive. She's sensitive.
You are listening to the Tami Talks Unscripted Healing Podcast, where we share stories that are, you guessed it, unscripted.
That's the thing, this journey doesn't stop.
It doesn't really
right?
end. We have a general sense of the topic each episode, but really the whole point is just to show up and be authentic and let our inner child speak its truth. And I have continued to work through that story of constantly hearing, well, we don't want, got a hot dog on our hands. Yeah, guess what, Mr. Sabatsky, you do. So I'm so excited that you are here, and it is my hope that you hear yourself somewhere in the story so that way you can feel seen and heard as well. So let's start talking. Welcome to the Tami Talks Unscripted Healing Podcast. For those of you that are brand new, welcome. And those of you that are joining me back, thank you, especially after last week's audio shenanigans. And this week I made sure that the microphone is actually facing the right way. So that's fantastic. And I've learned about this one is that I actually don't need it right in front of my face. And this one is better, a foot or so away. So some things out over here. I've got some webcams to play around with after this. So hopefully this Zoom one is sufficient for your viewing pleasures. But we are figuring things out over here. And I thank you all for just joining along the ride as I figure this out. And I said this last week in the little explanation video that part of me doing this and just being super vulnerable and open with the behind the scenes is because I want people to know it's okay to show up and it's okay to not 100% know what you're doing. But when you're excited and passionate about something, just taking action towards it is enough. And it is so healing for my inner child to know that she doesn't have to be perfect and that she can still show up regardless. And so I'm embracing that fully. But yeah, so here we are today. And oh man, after last week's episode, I just have to thank you all because I got such awesome feedback for showing up like I did. And people were like, Tami, the audio wasn't that bad, but you're right. The emotion that came through, it was straight from your heart and you could tell. And so thank you for sharing that episode. And so thank you for receiving me and all my imperfections and all of that jazz. So I'm very grateful for the feedback that you guys give me because just behind the scenes here, I don't know how you're receiving things. And my ego can tell me stories all day long about, oh my gosh, what are they going to think? And they're not going to tune back in and all this stuff. And so I appreciate your guys' feedback. And I really do love hearing from you and hearing how that episode resonated with you. Maybe if there was a takeaway, something that, evoked some emotion in you, whatever the case may be. I love hearing that because it really does help me, thinking ahead of what other topics and things might help you guys. That's why I'm doing this. It isn't just to hear myself talk. And actually, it isn't at all to hear myself talk. It's because I want to help. And so if there is a topic that you want me to riff on, let me know. I'm happy to do that because I get inspired on the daily. That's kind of why I feel like I have content for days is because I can walk outside and see a bird and be like, oh, I wonder what the meaning of that is. And I'll create a topic out of that. So it's fun to get inspired like that. And I encourage all of you to almost kind of step outside of yourselves, throughout your day to just notice the things around you. Because that is really what I do. I just pay attention. I'm just tuned in, to other people's energies, to the things that are going around me and noticing little signs and synchronicities that can really help guide you along the way and clue you into the fact that you are being guided along this crazy thing we call life, just like I am. And you'll figure it out as you go. So something that ended up being really kind of funny and ironic, last night, my daughter called me out on my own projections. And this is the blessing and curse of doing this work is that you end up, basically teaching your children to turn your work around on you. But I love that she was able to do that. So here's what happened is she wanted this Annie's mac and cheese. No, I'm not getting sponsored by them, but that would be awesome. Just kidding. She wanted that for supper last night. And I already had a little container of leftovers in the fridge from what they didn't finish last week. But of course, they didn't want that. I mean, who wants leftovers, right? I eat that every day. I do my meal prep on Mondays and I eat the same basically stuff all throughout the week. So I actually enjoy leftovers. But I can understand like mac and cheese is probably not the greatest reheated. I think we can all agree. So I understand that. What was interesting is her and my son both got done eating and they bring over their plates. And no, I had oranges on their plates. I had a bunch of like mini bell peppers for my daughter. And then I had cucumbers and tomatoes for my son because that's what he loves. And they were full of their like fruits and vegetables. And then they had this little thing of mac and cheese. And then they brought their plates over. All the fruits and veggies were gone, but they had leftover mac and cheese. And this is where I know I'm still working through stuff. And I notice when I get triggered because my logical, rational, healed self was just like, awesome. Like they eat all their fruits and veggies. Woohoo. But the triggered part of me who grew up in the you don't waste food era, which I'm sure many of you did, right? It was the whole clean your plate club thing. Is when I saw that I was going to probably be throwing more mac and cheese away. I it was just my energy. I didn't even need to say anything and already I could see it in my daughter's face that she knew that she disappointed me. And I was like, "Whoa," and I caught it right away. And she was able to catch me as well. And basically saying, "Well, I know that you're gonna be frustrated that there's leftover mac and cheese and you're gonna have to throw it away." And I'm like, "Hold up. Like, this is not a you thing. This is a me thing because first and foremost, I started my healing journey around food because I didn't want to pass it down on my daughter. I did not want her to feel like she needed to finish her plate and all of that stuff just to please me. And so I've done a lot of work around that and really trying to let them regulate themselves. And they are really, really good at that. So I'm like, if I've done anything right in this world, I feel like I raised some pretty healthy eaters and they know how to self regulate. They know when they're done eating, they know when they need more. Like, that's not up for me to tell them, and I know as parents, we can get frustrated when they say they're done and they say their tummy's full and then they come back for snacks, 5 minutes later. Yes, that can be frustrating. And sometimes a way around that is like, well, yeah, okay, if you're hungry later, the leftovers are in the fridge. Oh, you're going to end up having the same thing. It's not that we get to lead to more treats and snacks when you barely finished your supper. So there are things around that. And I'm sure I can create a whole, podcast on just kids and eating and all of that stuff. But anyway, what I noticed was that in that moment, she was feeling like I disappointed my mom because I didn't finish my food. And I made it very clear to her that this is not about you. This was something that is triggered within me because of how so many of us grew up. And again, this is not to blame my parents or their parents or anyone's parents. None of you. If you have done this, this is not blaming you. Please do not feel bad because this is just, it's conditioning. It's what so many of us learned. It's kind of what was going on, in society back then, you know, and it felt wasteful to waste food. And so oftentimes that's why a lot of us as adults have a hard time leaving food on our plate, even though we know better, even though we know we're full, is because it's something triggered from your childhood where you had to sit at the table for hours until you finished something. And that is, please, if you find yourself doing that with your kiddos, know that that is, again, your own projections, kind of going back to last week. And that is a you thing that we need to work through, and that reassuring our inner child that no, it's okay. Eat until you are physically satisfied. Because this is where it gets confusing is that some of us have been trained that I'm not satisfied until I'm full, uncomfortably full, because that's what you learned. That was the stopping point as a kid because you had to clean your plate. So there's a big difference between what is actually physically satisfying for your body versus what we have been trained to think is done. And that's where I think a lot of us adults have had a hard time with portion control because we learned that that ending point is, oh, that really uncomfortable, bloated, stuffed, loosen your belt kind of feeling when it isn't. Wow, I am realizing this was not the point of this episode, but I'm just going to go with it because this is unscripted, and I feel like okay, let's just rock and roll with this. But I want you to think about how early this can start. You know, I know so many of you probably did this. I did myself when you started feeding babies baby food or whatever. We do the whole airplane thing, like like one more bite, one more bite. Well, a baby tells you when they're done eating, when they turn their head, maybe they throw the bottle, or if you're nursing, like they turn their head, and you can try to stick that bottle in their face as much as you want, but if they're done, they're done, right? But we want to finish the bottle. There's still some left in there, right? We've got one more spoonful in this baby food jar. But your baby's like, yo, I'm good, stop. But because of our own conditioning, we think, no, you got to finish this when they are done. So this is how early that regulation gets thrown off. And I talked about intuition and getting detached from our intuition last week. This is how we get kind of detached from those internal regulation systems that we actually do have and that we were born with, because we had outside influences telling us, like, no, you're not done until this is empty. But when your body was like, yo, I was done 5 bites ago. Oh, so it's having to completely retrain that for so many of us adults. That's why it's so important as parents to try to do this work with yourself right now, so you're not projecting that onto your kids, so they're not having to relearn how to self-regulate when they're adults. So that, oh wow, full circle, Tammy. 'Cause really the title of this episode was supposed to be heal so your kids don't have to. And I really wasn't going to go on the food tangent about this, but there I just went. But it does apply. It applies to everything. Because I knew I wanted to talk about the mac and cheese story because it was a direct correlation to last week's episode and the whole projection thing, and that I was projecting my stuff about wasting food onto my daughter. But it created such a awesome conversation to be able to tell her, like, no, 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 you did not disappoint me. This is a me thing to work through. I love that you guys ate your fruits and vegetables first, and I'm glad that you self regulated. I do not want you stuffing your face with mac and cheese just because you think that's going to make me happy. Please do not do that. Right. So that was a really cool conversation. And I love that I can have those conversations with her now, because otherwise, if we wouldn't have had that conversation, she would have sensed my energy about that. She wouldn't have said anything. I wouldn't have said anything, but then she would have went the rest of the night feeling like I disappointed my mom. And that story, ego again, takes that and twists that and turns that into like every other area of her life where she can never do the right thing. She could never be good enough for her mom. And I was like, oh, hell no, she's not going to get that message from me, because it is so silly. Like that one thing. This is why this work is so important, because it happens in these really subtle moments. One little thing can turn into a big, massive thing that they're dealing with in their adult life if we don't have the conversations and the awareness now to talk about it in the moment now. So a small little thing like that one conversation, we just kind of nipped it in the bud right there, versus it turning into this big, massive thing where she feels like she can never live up to her mother's standards. I do not want that for my daughter at all. So that was that little story. But that leads me into another reason why I wanted to talk about this and why it's so important for us to heal so that our kids don't have to. And when I say that, I am fully aware that there is no such thing as perfect parenting. I am far from a perfect parent. I have examples all day long about how I mess up. But that is part of this, is that I'm willing to tell my kids when I mess up. I'm willing to now apologize when I mess up. And that alone is very healing, because if we're telling them, like, hey, it's okay to make mistakes, but yet we're never willing to apologize or own up to those things, but yet we're expecting our kids to do that, you can see where that's sending a conflicting message, right? And so I fully wide open with them that, yeah, messed up, straight up messed up. I got triggered in that moment. And I can own that, and I can make sure that we, now that we know better, can do better. So I was volunteering in my son's school, and I love it. And doing this inner child work, it's so hard for me to turn it off. I can't. I'm again, I mentioned last week that it's just like this little matrix thing going on in my head as it just happens naturally. It's not like I'm trying to think of these things. It just happens. I see people's behaviors and I see these kids' behaviors, and I saw it so early on when these kids would come up and we're playing these games, like who was already, maybe that little people pleaser starting off, or who was the little perfectionist in the way they colored and the way that they, were maybe handing out the cards. It was really interesting. And for example, there was one little boy, we were to pick, crayons. And I'm like, which color would you like? What's your favorite color? And he immediately told me what his dad and his brother's favorite color was. I was like, well, what's your favorite color? Like, I don't know. Like, wait a second. Wait a second here. And it just like made me think of all the adults that I know, myself included, where it's like you're always thinking about everybody else and you completely forget about yourself. To the point where this little boy hasn't even thought about his favorite color. Right. And I was like, we're going to work on that. And so, I was kind of talking to him about, what interests him and what excites him. And I'm like, and that's awesome that you know what your dad and brother's favorite colors are. Like, that's really awesome of you to notice those things. But I'm really curious about what's your favorite color. And then a little bit later, this other little girl comes up and we get done playing the card game. And she says, she's like, I want to stack the cards up for you for the next kid. She's like, I love helping, except my mom. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean by that? And I basically said, like, well, why is that? And this is what she said straight up. She said, because every time I try to help her, she just yells at me. Ooh, ooh, ooh. I'm like, well, why do you think that is? And she said, well, because she's always so busy trying to do everything around the house because my dad is on the couch playing video games. I was like, well, okay, that makes sense. Your mom's pretty frustrated. She's feeling like she's doing everything around the house and feeling frustrated that no one's helping. But yet now she's so busy that it's like, well, I better do it myself. One, because no one else is going to help. But I don't even want anyone to help now because it's going to take more time to explain how to do it, or they're not going to do it right. So I'll just do it myself. Right. So that is her mom's own stuff and her dad's own stuff. But what was heartbreaking about that is that there was a little girl, 5 years old, who I'm getting all kinds of goosebumps and emotions coming up. Because all I can see is this 5-year-old girl internalizing all of this, not understanding, like, I just want to help and I just want to be around my mom. But for some reason, that's not good enough. And how she is going to take that message, whatever I do to try to help is never good enough. And how she is going to carry that throughout, hopefully not her entire life, that she's never going to be good enough. Maybe for her mother, she's never going to live up to her mother's standards, but I guarantee you it's going to show up in so many other relationships in her life. Not enough. Never enough. And the other thing is, if she's not feeling seen by her dad because he's zoned out doing his own thing, is also this little girl who is going to try to feel seen. And we do that in lots of ways that aren't always the greatest. Trying to get someone's attention, especially as a little girl. Like as a mother, that terrifies me because I think of the stuff that I've done to try to be seen over the years, and I'm not proud of a lot of it. And I have a pretty tame, lame childhood, but I certainly know when there were times, even in my adult life, when I did things simply to try to feel seen that went against my intuition. And I'm like, but this is what happens is obviously there's stuff going on in the home, right? Both parents coming in with their own childhood wounds. Now they're triggering each other. And what happens is this little 5-year-old girl is getting caught in all of it. And her ego is internalizing all of this and starting to create these stories. And if we don't help our little people They are going to be adults who then continue this cycle. And that's why I'm so passionate about this work and trying to get this message out there so we can heal, so we can help our little people, so they don't have to do this kind of work. And it's not to say that we're not going to give them wounds along the way. I said, like, I'm very open and transparent that I'm doing this work, but I tell my daughter that all the time, both kids. Like, I'm doing this because I don't want to pass it down to you. I don't want this to be your story growing up. I don't want you to have to heal this stuff when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So I want to handle it right now because I can see this happening all around us. And I know I've been that parent on both sides. I've been that mom who has probably just been like, just get out of the way. Just let me do it myself. Right? Because it's like, we've got stuff to do. We just want to get it done. We don't want the little people getting in the way because it just slows down the process. But you got to stop and think about the message that might be sending them. Or when we're on our phones all the time and our kids are trying to get our attention. Like, again, this is because there's probably something going on in the dad's life where he needs to check out, where he needs to dissociate. There's feelings and emotions that maybe he's not dealing with. And so sitting there playing games is his way of escaping what he actually needs to feel and heal. It's not because he's a terrible dad or she's a terrible mom. It's because they got their own stuff, but they're finding their own ways of navigating around it rather than actually healing and processing and working through this stuff. And that's the thing is, what you don't know, you don't know. And that's why I have this podcast. That's why because I know if I were to have told those parents what that little girl said, they would be like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I do not want that to be the message that my daughter receives from me. I want to make sure that my daughter feels seen by her dad. Right? I know they would have. Because that's the thing. Is like no one does this stuff intentionally. I shouldn't say no one. Oof. But that's where we have to allow ourselves to look at ourselves and look within to be like, where am I projecting my wounds now onto my kids, onto other people? Right. And that's what last week's episode was so much about. But now I know this episode is going to hit hard for a lot of parents, but I'm right there with you. And that is why I have been doing this work, because what I recognized is that I have to create emotional safety within myself so I can then help create that environment for my kids. Because I haven't always done that. Right. Because my conditioning, again, you weren't modeled emotional regulation, it's very likely that maybe you witnessed, parents or whatever going from 0 to 10, right? There was no like step-by-step process of like, oh, I'm escalating and yeah, I'm not getting really upset. It was just like, boom. That was probably really loud in mic, sorry. And it's also the same way, like, how do you step down? How do you start to calm your body back down and get back down to emotional safety? But if we're constantly feeling like we're walking around eggshells, that doesn't feel safe for someone to express their feelings and their emotions, and they won't. They will start to safeguard them, right? Because my daughter doesn't want to disappoint me. My daughter doesn't want to make me mad. So she's not going to tell me how she feels because I'm not creating that safe environment for her. And I'm going to share this story because I think it's so relatable. And I carried around so much guilt and shame about this until I did this healing work, until I understood why this happened. And actually, the memory just came up. Gosh, in my little Google Photos, the picture came up of my daughter. I believe she was 3. Yes. And she was in this Sleeping Beauty dress. And we were going to this whole princess gala thing here in town where all of the Disney princesses were going to be. And, and there wasn't like a hard start time. It was basically the event is from here to here, show up whenever. So no pressure, no like gotta get there kind of things. But for whatever reason, she's 3 and I'm trying to let her be independent, put on her own coat and things. And I could feel myself starting to get triggered. Again, at this time, I have no idea what any of these words are. But looking back, that's exactly what was happening is I was starting to get frustrated. I was starting to get a little anxious, right? So those feelings were starting to come up. And for whatever reason, something just finally, whew, I went from 0 to 10. And I'm not proud of this. But what I did was I turned real swiftly and ended up kicking a hole in the wall right in front of my daughter. Yep, that happened. That happened. And that is where ego will put you in awful situations because immediately I snapped out of it because I saw the look on my daughter's face and how scared she was in that moment. Like, what just happened? Right? Like, ego took over the steering wheel and thought, let's, you know, we're going to feel triggered, go into kind of fight. And I kicked the hole in the wall. Like, what? What was this about? And I didn't know then, like, why I got so triggered, why my reaction was to do that. And of course, like, I'm apologizing immediately. I feel terrible. And no joke, I carried around that guilt and shame and all the things for years. And ours has a great memory. And so she remembered and she brought it up all the time. And I would continue to talk about it and own it and apologize and all these things. But then once I started doing this work, I really understood why that happened. And again, emotional regulation. And this is where generational stuff comes into play because this stuff wasn't taught to us. It wasn't taught to our parents. So I have no like fault or blame on my parents for not being able to appropriately teach me how to emotionally regulate because they didn't know. Right. And their parents didn't know and their parents didn't know. Because again, so many of us came from the sweep it under the rug thing, get back to work, you're fine generation. And so no one is to blame, but that's where at some point we have to be the ones to be like, hold up, this doesn't feel right. So I know that that was part of my conditioning, right? But then I even took it a step further and to understand like why I felt so triggered. And it made me think back to this story from high school. And I'm sorry, I'm going to call out one of my sisters here, but this isn't a her thing. But once she got her driver's license, I started to ride to school with her. And she went by her own time. And oftentimes we would arrive late to school. Well, my first hour teacher was kind of, yeah, you know what, and was not afraid to call you out in front of everyone. And so that memory, like, why did it trigger me so much that she was kind of poking around and we were going to be late, even though we weren't really going to be late, but there was something about that, right? And so that was my first memory. And whether or not that's the actual thing where the wound originated, it doesn't matter. What matters is it brought me back to that time period where I was called out repeatedly for being late in front of my class and that embarrassing feeling to the point where I eventually started riding the bus again because it wasn't worth the wrath of my teacher. And so that like triggered me of that, like, come on, let's go. We got to get going. Otherwise, we're going to get in trouble. But was that an appropriate response in that setting with my 3-year-old daughter in a Sleeping Beauty costume? No, no, it was not. But now I understand why. And we've actually had this talk, and it's been like really healing to be able to explain to her kind of why that was the reaction and to be able to tell her, like, that wasn't about you. That was not about you. And now she's done and has released that story. But the thing is I needed to learn how to emotionally regulate because the kids are never going to feel safe coming to me with their own stuff if they think I'm going to fly off the handle if they tell me something. I need my kids to know that they can come to me with anything, especially the stuff that they're worried about, especially the things that they maybe aren't proud of and that they actually do need support and guidance through. I don't want them hiding things because they're afraid that it's going to make me mad or sad. And I have had to do a lot of work to start to create that foundation, but it had to start with me. It had to start within myself to notice when I was feeling triggered and how I could emotionally regulate myself. And sometimes that was just feeling it, giving myself permission to, go into another room and take some deep breaths. Or maybe sometimes I just have to close my eyes and take some deep breaths so I can feel that calm. back down again. It's like on that bus, ego is trying to take over the wheel. And I need to be like, I got to stop this bus, collect myself. I need you to sit back. You don't get to drive. You don't get to drive this bus. I am driving. But sometimes I literally need to pull the bus over, stop, take some deep breaths, refocus. Otherwise, ego will swoop in and take that steering wheel and get me into trouble and kick holes in the wall. And so it's been really, really amazing, especially over this last year, to see both kids, but especially my daughter, start to feel safe. Because it was like pulling teeth to try to get her to tell me how she felt. And oftentimes she was worried that it would make me mad or make me sad. And I was like, I can't do anything with that if I don't know. Like, I want to do better, but I can't do anything with that if I don't know. And so she started to feel safe in that, started to feel like, okay, mom actually means that. She really does mean that when she says that, and everything is going to be okay. And I can be open and honest with her. And sometimes, like, the truth hurts, right? But I have told her, I'm like, if something that you say triggers me and makes me sad or mad, I know enough to know that that is something that I have to look at. That's something within me. That's not about you. And so right away, then she knows that it is safe for me to tell her this because she's not going to blame me or turn it back on me. So it's safe for me to be able to tell her how I feel now, even if I'm mad at her, even if she did something that triggered me, because then we can actually talk about it. And the other night, we were, kind of talking about her, talking to someone and what she was going to talk about. And it's like, oh, like, you're going to talk about school stuff or, like mom stuff. She's like, well, I don't need to talk about you. Like, you're good. And I was like, what? Because I've done this work and I have really, really done this work to help, again, create that emotional safety within myself so I can create that foundation for my kids because I do not want them to feel like they have to walk on eggshells around me. And so this is where it's so important to help your kids by healing yourself, by checking in with yourself, by learning how to emotionally regulate yourself. Because if we don't allow ourselves to feel the range of emotions and feel safe when we feel really angry or when we feel really sad, how are we going to help our kids do that? What we're teaching them is like, nope, you're only lovable, socially acceptable when you're happy. That's the only emotion that is approved. And so they start to shut down all of the other ones because they don't feel like it's safe for me to be upset. Or I don't want to tell my mom that I'm mad at her because then she'll feel sad. Like, no, 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 no. We need to be able to have those conversations. And if anything that they say triggers us, like that's something for us to go within and to look at and to see where that's coming up for us. And so this emotional regulation stuff is so, so, so key. And I think hopefully now in schools and stuff, they're learning more about that. And we're seeing more tools and methods and tips and tricks on how to help our kids do that. But that has to start with us. And you see it all over. I see it with kids all of the time. And when kids act out and they have behaviors, again, we can look at this kid like, oh, they're a bad kid. Like, no, they just weren't taught how to emotionally regulate. And whatever they are, however it's coming out is what they're being modeled at home. That starts with us. That starts with us. And again, that's where allowing yourself to take in this information and to be able to look at it is so important. We often say like, I would die for my kids. I would do anything for my kids. Well, if that's the case, then start to look at where your childhood wounds might be getting in the way of you truly showing up for your kids in a way that feels emotionally supportive. You may provide for them. They may have food on the table. They may have new clothes. They may be in sports things, and you're doing all of those things on the surface. But they need to know that they have emotional safety with you. Emotional safety with you. But that has to start with you. Do you feel emotionally safe within you? How do you feel when you cry? And this is where I hate. Sorry, I know that's a strong word. When people say that phrase of like having a breakdown or I'm losing it. No, you're not losing it. You're actually allowing yourself to feel your damn feelings for once. That's what feeling feels like. because we're not used to it. We're used to having to package it up in this pretty little package that's socially acceptable for people. So when you have emotions, it feels like you're out of control. It feels like you're breaking down. No, you're just feeling. You're alive. Ugh, that- girl. But we have to feel safe in our own bodies to feel those things. And you need those outlets to be able to do that. And so that's why sometimes like getting outside can be a great way to help relieve that and to clear that, whether you need to go outside and yell, whether you need to go outside and cry or whatever. You need those outlets to help you process through those emotions, right? Like working out for me is a great way for me to relieve aggression or tension and things like that. Whereas maybe yoga is something I might do if I really am feeling more emotional sadness or something like that. I might move that way. Or if I really just need to kind of feel free, like I've been feeling trapped, like maybe that's when I need to get outside. And so you start to kind of figure out these little pockets of things that when I'm feeling this way, I can go do this. Right. And I remember when I worked at the healthcare facility, I worked with this health psychologist and he used this great analogy. He's like, we practice fire drills, right? So in an emergency, we know what to do, but we don't do that when we're feeling triggered. And that's where ego will swoop in and say, hey, there's a bag of potato chips. Why don't you go do that instead? Or, hey, let's just go, crack open that beer or that bottle of wine. You're feeling triggered from your hard day. You had a really stressful day. Rather than know how to actually sit with that and process that, ego swoops in and says, no, 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 no. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. Let's just numb that. And that's what typically happens. And so it's really, really important for us to learn, like, how can I feel safe in all of my emotions so I can then help my kids? Or I can even help people around me, whether you have kids or not, to be able to see people in your work environment, whatever, when they're, maybe getting agitated and you can start to see, oh, that maybe triggered them. And then you can have that different perspective and making sure that you're not attaching to their story, right? Don't let their projections sit with you and impact you. You can detach that and know, like, oh, no, that they were feeling triggered by something and that wasn't about me. I was just their mirror in that moment. And that's literally what we are. We are walking mirrors for everyone. My kids are mirrors for me. Anyone that ever triggers me, upsets me, whatever, I know immediately, ooh, here's another lesson. Like, what is this for me? What am I supposed to learn here? What do I need to heal still? Like, that's immediately where I go to now. Because otherwise, I'll get stuck in that cycle of thinking it was about this other person, wanting to blame them, again, keeping everything outside of myself, like we talked about last week. And that's what ego does. But it allows you to really look within, but you have to start to have some of that emotional regulation built in. Practice those things. So that way, when you are triggered, you know what? I need to pull this bus over. I need to take a deep breath. And then I can talk to my kids about what just happened. But I probably shouldn't react from that super triggered place. And so having kind of that emergency plan, like when I get triggered, this is what I can do. And eventually you'll start to build, they'll just kind of come in naturally, where if you're checking in with yourself more throughout your day, you're tending to your emotions all throughout the day. So it's not this come home from work and rather than have to feel all of the emotions from the day that I was too busy to check in with, now they all come rushing in the moment that I come through the door and I'm not prepared to feel them. So I'm going to numb them. And kids are such an amazing example of this because I just had this conversation with someone today about, and teachers will say this all the time, like your kids, oh, they were great. Or when they were in daycare, like, oh, they were perfect. They were great all day. And then they come home and they're monsters. That's because they held it in, right? To be socially acceptable, to be well behaved when they were with other people. But you should be their safe person where they can open up and express all of their emotions because they were holding them in all day. So they come home and they release all of it on you, which feels unfair. But it's also like, you know what? I'm their safe person. But think about, we still do that as adults. We're not checking in with ourselves throughout the day. We're not checking in with how we feel because we're so busy. We're answering the emails. We're doing all of these things and we ignore it to the point where then we get home and we also, our inner child just wants to let it all out too, but we don't because ego's like, no, we don't feel feelings here. We're going to numb them instead. Okay. Okay. And that's where you have to be like, no, I actually do need to process this. So I need to come up with strategies. Maybe I need to jam out to some music on my way home from work Maybe I need to sing a sad song so I can cry. Maybe I need to turn on some heavy metal and jam out to get the anger out from that meeting. Or maybe when I get home, I need to immediately go for a walk to clear my energy so I'm not bringing that home to my kids who then think that I'm mad at them because I'm short fused because of work stuff, but now I'm taking it out on them. Now they're going to create these stories about me and thinking it's about them when it's not. So this is where this can go on and on and on, but this starts with us. So I'm going to wrap this up because you can tell I can go on and on and on about this topic. And I have seriously so many examples of this. And I'm willing to be open and vulnerable with my stories. And I'm not worried about judgment because I understand why I have done the things that I have done that maybe I'm not proud of, but I can have so much compassion and healing for that version of me that didn't have the tools then. The same way I can for my parents and for their parents and whatever. This isn't about blaming yourself or anyone. It's about taking responsibility for the fact that now that I know better, I can do better. And that work starts with me. And when we say we would do anything for our kids, heal for your kids. Look at your own story. Look at your own childhood wounds. And if you need help doing that, that is what I'm here for. And that is what I love to do because I love helping you connect dots to be able to see, oh my gosh, I get triggered all the time when this happens. And I had no idea it was because of this. But I see how this is playing out and how my kids are starting to change their behavior around me, all of this stuff. And so we can quickly put an end to that and give you some tools to be able to help you so the cycle stops with you and so that we're not passing these things down and so they can get the best traits of you, right? All the good stuff. And also to be able to help you feel comfortable and safe admitting when you do mess up because you're going to. I mess up all the time. And I tell you what, it actually feels really liberating to just be able to say that and own that. And so at any point, if you ever wanted to hop on and do a discovery call to just see, I don't know, some of the stuff that you're talking about is resonating, we can start to pinpoint some of that stuff. So I do free discovery calls for people for 30 minutes just to kind of touch on some of that stuff, or there's options to do just a 90-minute deep dive. You'll be amazed at what we can find in 90 minutes. This is where I put on my detective hat. I'm like, let's go. We're going in. I got my headlamp and everything to be able to help you start to connect some of those dots. And it's truly what I love to do because I know just that one moment of awareness where you can really see it all laid out and start connecting those dots, how impactful that can be for you, but also how impactful it can be for your kids. So please reach out if that's ever something that you want to do and explore. I'd be happy to do that with you. So again, if anything in this episode resonated, please comment, all that stuff. Yeah. And again, just give yourself a big hug. If any of this, don't let your ego make you feel guilty or shameful or embarrassed or anything. Do not let your ego do that. That's what it's going to want to try to do. Or it's going to be like, stop listening to her podcast. It's making you feel bad. No, your eye yourself will be like, no, this is how we heal. Your inner child, no, please keep listening because she's giving you clues into what we need to heal. And so kind of recognizing all of that. And so if at any point that would be helpful, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week with next week, because I'm sure you guys are done with just me here behind the camera. So I've got a whole bunch of amazing guests lined up. Now that I'm kind of figuring some of this stuff out on my own, there's a whole story to that as well. But I appreciate you guys bearing with me as I kind of try to figure this out and continue to just show up. So thank you all so much for joining me today. And as always, please be sure to check in with your inner child. Allow yourself to feel the feels, have some safety parameters around that and how you can support yourself. But the best thing you can do is just check in with your inner child. Every little kiddo just needs you to check in on them once in a while, right? Be like, hey, how you doing? How was your day? Do that same thing for yourself and it will work wonders. All right, signing off, everybody. Thanks for joining.